Marlene Dietrich never existed. What you are accustomed to seeing in black and white photographs, the flawless profile, the cold gaze from beneath half-closed eyelids, the cigarette smoke coiling around a man's tuxedo, is not a human being. It is perhaps the most complex and cruel optical illusion of the 20th century. Marlene. You clicked on this headline because you know the legend. You have heard about the Blue Angel, about her romances with Remarque and Hemingway, about her songs that made soldiers weep on both sides of the front. But you are not here for that. You are here to learn the price. Because behind this facade of the steel orchid lay a history of monstrous self-suppression. We are not going to simply recite Wikipedia. Instead, we will dismantle the mechanism of this invention. We will analyze how a lively, plump German girl named Maria Magdalena cold-bloodedly killed herself to make room for a goddess who does not age, does not feel pain, and never sleeps. Today, we will answer the questions that biographers usually shamefully bypass. Did she really use medical tape and gold dust to construct her face in real time? Why did a woman who held power over the most influential men of the century call herself a nurse and die in absolute ringing loneliness? And most importantly, how did it happen that the freedom she so fiercely defended eventually became her prison cell the size of a Parisian bedroom? To assemble this picture, we analyzed not only her films, but also the technical writers of her shoots, medical reports, and those very telephone conversations of her final years where, while bedridden, she continued to play her role. Fasten your seatbelts. This is not a story of success. This is an instruction manual for assembling a human being who decided to become an immortal symbol, forgetting that symbols do not know how to be happy. To understand how a person can turn into a prisoner of their own image, we need to return to the beginning, not to the moment of glory, but to the workbench where this glory was forged. And the word workbench here is not a metaphor. If you look at the early photographs of Marlene Dietrich, from the times when her name was still Maria Magdalena, you will experience true cognitive dissonance. You will not see any steel orchid there. You will see a plump, rosy-cheeked German girl who was affectionately, but hurtfully, called Potato by her family. She has soft facial features, a slightly heavy figure, and an expression full of bourgeois contentment with life. This was a woman created to bear children, cook soup, and play the violin in the living room. There was no mystery in this woman. There was only biology. But Marlene hated biology. She despised naturalness because naturalness meant ordinariness. And here enters the man who became the architect of her face, the director Josef von Sternberg. Their meeting was not love at first sight in the usual sense. It was the meeting of a sculptor and a perfect block of marble. Sternberg looked at this potato and told her something that would have destroyed any other actress. You are thick, and the light does not like you. But we will fix this. And they began to fix it. The myth says that Marlene Dietrich lost weight thanks to diets and willpower. The reality is much more frightening and prosaic. There was a diet, but it could not change the bone structure. And Sternberg needed bones. He needed those famous hollow cheeks on which, as contemporaries said, one could cut oneself. How do you get hollow cheeks if nature rewarded you with a round face? You cannot simply suck them in. You must change the anatomy of the skull. There is a persistent version, confirmed by many sources, that Marlene took a radical step. She removed her molars. Not for medical reasons, not because of cavities. She pulled out healthy teeth to disrupt the natural support of the cheek muscles. Without the support of the molars, the soft tissues caved inward, creating that dramatic shadow under the cheekbones, which became her calling card. Imagine the level of obsession. A young woman voluntarily goes to a dentist and asks to tear out parts of her body to look better in the black and white spectrum. This was the first act of sacrifice. Maria Magdalena gave up her teeth so that Marlene could be born. But anatomy is only half the battle. The second half is light. Marlene Dietrich is often called a great actress, but this is not entirely accurate. She was a great lighting engineer. She knew more about light than any cinematographer she worked with. Sternberg taught her the main rule. Light is a brush with which we paint your face over your real face. They developed a scheme that entered filmmaking textbooks as butterfly light, but in her case, it was taken to the absolute. The main light source was always positioned high, directly above her face, in the center. Why? To create a hard shadow under the nose, hiding its lack of refinement in Marlene's opinion, and, more importantly, to emphasize those artificial hollows in her cheeks. This required superhuman discipline. On the set, Marlene did not simply play a role. She performed a highly complex physical stunt. She knew that if she turned her head 2 centimeters to the left or lowered her chin 1 degree lower, the magic would disappear. The shadow would fall in the wrong place, the potato would return, and the goddess would die. Colleagues recalled that she could stand motionless for hours while the lights were being set. She felt the heat of the spotlight with her skin and could tell the operator, "Your baby, the small spotlight, has shifted. Adjust the barn door." And she was always right. She demanded that a full-length mirror always stand next to the camera. She did not look at her scene partner. She looked at her reflection, controlling every millimeter of her image. It was total control. She trusted no one but the mirror. But time passed, and biology began to take its toll. Gravity is the enemy of any engineer, and Marlene declared war on gravity. When she passed 40 and then 50, maintaining the illusion of a sculptural face became harder. Plastic surgery of that time was crude and risky. Marlene chose a different path, mechanical. She invented what makeup artists today call the Croydon facelift, but in her execution, it was an instrument of torture. The method was as follows. She took thin strands of hair at the temples, wound them tightly around hairpins, and pulled them back with force, securing them at the back of her head under a wig. The tension was so strong that the skin on her face was literally stretched over her skull, smoothing out wrinkles and lifting her eyebrows. It was excruciatingly painful. The scalp bled. From constant tension, hair began to fall out, and migraines became her constant companions. But this did not stop Marlene. If the hair tension was insufficient, she used medical plaster and adhesive tape, taping the skin behind her ears and under her chin, hiding these constructions under collars and scarves. Think about this moment. The whole world looked at the screen and saw an eternally young, inaccessible goddess who sings about love with a slight half-smile. And in reality, at that moment, standing before the camera was a woman whose head was splitting with pain, whose skin was taped to the limit of tearing, and who was afraid to move lest this construction fall apart. She also began to use gold powder. Literally, she ordered wigs that were sprinkled with real gold dust. It seemed to her that on screen, this would create a halo effect, a radiance coming from within. She spent thousands of dollars to make her hair glow, because the ordinary shine of hair seemed too earthly, too dull to her. And the older she got, the more time this assembly took. If in the 1930s she needed an hour for makeup, then in the 1960s, the process of transforming an aging woman into Marlene took up to 6 hours. 6 hours every day before the mirror. 6 hours of fighting reality. She sculpted herself like clay, layer by layer, stroke by stroke. It is here that we find the key to understanding her tragedy. Why did she become the first victim of her goddess? Because Marlene Dietrich ceased to be a human being. She became a project. She treated her body not as a temple, but as an instrument that needed to be sharpened, broken, and tailored for the sake of the result. And the scariest part is that she herself believed that the picture in the mirror was more important than the woman looking into that mirror. She created a visual contract with the viewer. I am perfection. I am eternity. But while signing this contract, she did not read the fine print. You do not have the right to be old. You do not have the right to be tired. You do not have the right to be yourself. This engineering miracle worked flawlessly while she was on stage. But what happens to a perfect machine when its resources are exhausted? What does a sculptor do when the marble begins to crumble? She could not allow the world to see the cracks. And this brings us to the darkest and most paradoxical stage of her life. To the moment when she decided that if she could no longer assemble herself for the public, then the public would never see her again. We are approaching the door of an apartment on Avenue Montaigne in Paris. The very door that closed in 1979 and did not open for outsiders for the next 12 years. Paris, Avenue Montaigne, number 12. One of the most prestigious addresses in the world. Here, in the heart of the Golden Triangle, opposite the Dior boutique where shop windows scream of eternal youth and luxury, on the 4th floor, time stopped in 1979. It was then that Marlene Dietrich, a woman whose legs were insured for 1,000,000 marks, stumbled. A ridiculous accident, a fracture of the femoral neck. For an ordinary person, this is a medical problem requiring surgery and rehabilitation. For Marlene Dietrich, this became the signal for the final cut. She understood. The body no longer obeys. The instrument is broken. And she made a decision that seems insane if looked at through the eyes of a layperson, but absolutely logical if we remember that we are speaking about the creator of a myth. She decided to wall herself up alive. 12 years. Think about this duration. That is 4,380 days. She spent this much time in one room, in one bed, practically not changing her body position. She turned her bedroom into a sarcophagus, into a bunker where not a single ray of sunlight penetrated, capable of revealing treacherous wrinkles or sagging skin. The curtains were drawn tight. Always, the reality reigning in this room was shocking. If you, a viewer in love with the image of the blue angel, had entered there, you would have vomited. Not from old age, but from the contrast. The great Marlene, the symbol of elegance, lay on stale sheets, surrounded by mountains of empty alcohol bottles and sleeping pill packages. She practically stopped washing. It was not just a rejection of hygiene, it was a form of protection. To wash means to undress. To undress means to see oneself, to see one's body, flabby, old, helpless. She could not bear this sight. She preferred the smell of decay to a meeting with reality. Moreover, she refused the help of nurses in the most intimate matters. To prevent foreign eyes from seeing the sacred ruins, she used improvised means. A famous detail that biographers often omit out of pity, but which is necessary to understand the scale of her sacrifice. Marlene Dietrich, the icon of style, used a common pitcher or jar to relieve herself without getting out of bed. She hurled these containers under the bed, turning the space around her into a dump site. Why? Had she gone mad? No. And therein lies the horror. Her mind remained sharp as a razor. She did this consciously. She sacrificed her human dignity, comfort, and cleanliness for one single goal: to preserve the secret. No one, absolutely no one, was to see her like this. For the outside world, she had to remain who she was on film. And here, the main tool of her final years comes into play: the telephone. If the body was dead, the voice was alive. The telephone became her only channel of communication with the world, her radio station broadcasting from the crypt. Marlene hung on the line for hours. She called world leaders: Ronald Reagan, Mikhail Gorbachev, François Mitterrand. Imagine the surrealism of this scene. An old woman in a dirty nightgown, lying among leftovers and pills, picks up the receiver and, with that commanding steel voice, teaches presidents how to rule the world. And they listened. They listened because on the other end of the line, for them, was not a crazy recluse, but a legend. She virtuously managed this audio performance. When journalists called her, she instantly turned on Marlene. She knew how to modulate her voice so that it sounded 30 years younger. She laughed her trademark low laugh, told tales about Hemingway, flirted. She created the illusion that she would hang up the phone, throw on a feather boa, and head to Maxim's to drink champagne. But as soon as the receiver was placed on the cradle, the magic disappeared. Only pain, loneliness, and fear remained. The culmination of this period was the work on the documentary film Marlene in 1984 by director Maximilian Schell. This is a unique document of the era that clearly demonstrates that she ended up a prisoner of the image she helped create. Schell wanted to make a film about her. Marlene agreed, but set a condition that would have broken any other director. "You will not film me." She forbade showing herself as she was today, not a single frame, not a single second. The entire film is her voiceover superimposed on old chronicles, and in this audio commentary, a real war unfolds. Schell tries to break through to the human, asking uncomfortable questions about the past, about feelings. Marlene attacks in response. She screams, she lies, she cuts him off. She directs the film about herself without leaving her apartment. In one moment, she shouts at Schell, "I have been photographed to death." In this phrase lies the key to everything. She felt that her image had been captured, fixed, and replicated so much that the original became simply an unnecessary appendage. She was protecting those photographs from comparison with the original. The most tragic relationship in this sarcophagus unfolded between Marlene and her daughter, Maria Riva. Maria was the only one sometimes allowed to enter the Holy of Holies. But Marlene did not see a daughter in her. She saw an employee of her corporation. Lying in bed, Marlene criticized her daughter's appearance. "You look terrible. Why are you not wearing makeup? You are disgracing me." Think of the monstrous irony. A woman rotting alive scolds a healthy, active daughter for not being glamorous enough. Marlene was jealous of her daughter's life. Maria was alive. She walked the streets. She aged naturally. Marlene hated this natural aging in others because it reminded her of what she had lost. She turned into a tyrant. She demanded constant attention, but pushed away any warmth. Love implies intimacy, and intimacy implies that someone will see your flaws. Therefore, Marlene replaced love with control. She controlled her daughter, controlled the memory of herself, controlled, as it seemed to her, world politics through the telephone. It was a perfectionist's hell. She knew she was dying. Her kidneys were failing. Her body was covered in bed sores. But she forbade calling doctors. Hospitalization would mean she would be carried out of the apartment on a stretcher. Paparazzi would photograph her. the world would see an infirm old woman. "I will be carried out of here only feet first in a closed box," she decided, and she kept her word. On May 6, 1992, Marlene Dietrich died. The official version was renal failure. The unofficial, but widely discussed version was an overdose of sleeping pills. Perhaps this was her final act of directing. She felt that her strength was leaving, that she might lose control over her consciousness and become a vegetable. And a goddess cannot be a vegetable. So she gave the command herself. Stop. Cut. When the coffin was carried out of the apartment on Avenue Montaigne, it was covered with a French flag, and a bouquet of simple wildflowers lay on top. The body was hidden. No one saw her face. The crowd on the street applauded the legend, unaware of the hell this legend had spent the last 12 years in. She won. Reality could not surpass her myth because she killed reality before it managed to show itself to the public. But at what price? The price was that Marlene the human died in total isolation, hating her body, fearing light and people. She built a temple to her beauty, went inside, locked the door, and threw the key out the window. But where did this steel, masculine will come from? Where did this need to control everything and everyone, suppressing the feminine principle within herself, come from? To understand this, we need to rewind the tape to the era of her prime and look at how she hacked the gender code. To understand how a woman can lie in one bed for 12 years without asking for help, one must understand the nature of the armor she wore all her life. And in Marlene Dietrich's case, this armor was sewn from English wool according to the patterns of a man's tuxedo. We are used to seeing women in trousers. Today, it is the norm. Office dress code, comfort. But what Marlene did in the 1930s was not fashion. It was a military operation. It was a precise, calculated hack of the social matrix. Let us return to 1930. The premiere of the film Morocco. Marlene appears on screen. She is not in a sequined dress, not in furs. She is in a man's tailcoat and top hat. She holds a cigarette the way dock workers do, but with the grace of an aristocrat. She walks through the hall, sees a beautiful woman at a table, leans down to her, and kisses her on the lips. The hall freezes. In this moment, long before the sexual revolution, Marlene Dietrich committed something greater than just a scandal. She appropriated the male gaze. Before her, a woman in cinema was always an object. She was looked at. She was desired. She was chosen. Marlene flipped the board. By putting on trousers, she declared, "I am not the one who is looked at. I am the one who looks. I am not the one who is chosen. I choose for myself." This is gender hacking. She understood that in a patriarchal world, all power, all freedom, and most importantly, all safety belong to men. And instead of fighting for women's rights in the traditional way, she simply stepped across the border and became a man in the eyes of society, while retaining hypnotic female beauty. But this trick had a double bottom, and this is where the tragedy begins. Marlene used the male suit not to hide her body, but to create a perfect optical illusion. Remember the potato. Marlene always considered her hips too wide, too German. The male cut of trousers with a high waist and wide legs ideally masked this flaw, elongating the silhouette, making it infinite. She used clothes as an architectural structure, hiding the real woman inside a steel frame of style. In 1933, this frame underwent a strength test. Marlene arrived in Paris. The prefect of police, learning of her visit, publicly stated that if Madame Dietrich appeared on the streets of Paris in men's trousers, she would be immediately arrested for violating public morality. What would an ordinary star do? She would wear a skirt to avoid a scandal. What did Marlene do? She got off the train at the Gare du Nord station in a tweed men's suit, a coat of mail cut, a tie, and a beret. She walked through the crowd of policemen, looking them straight in the eyes with icy calmness, and no one dared to touch her. On that day, she proved, rules are written for women. But Marlene Dietrich is not a woman. She is something else. She is a third sex. She cultivated this myth herself. At heart, I am a gentleman, she loved to repeat. And this was not coquetry. This was her psychological defense against vulnerability. A gentleman does not cry. A gentleman keeps his word. A gentleman protects, not seeks protection. By trying on the role of a man, she fell into a trap she had set herself. She became the man every woman wanted and the woman every man wanted. But who was she to herself? This image created a vacuum around her. Men were afraid of her. How can one court a woman who wears a tuxedo better than you? How can one protect a woman who can put a police chief in his place with a single glance? She castrated men with her image. Next to her, they felt weak, imperfect. That is why her personal life turned into a series of strange, often sexless unions. She was not looking for a strong shoulder, because she was the strong shoulder herself. Androgyny became her curse. It gave her freedom from social norms, but took away the right to weakness. An ordinary woman can afford to be tired, can afford to lean on someone. The gentleman, Marlene Dietrich, had no right to this. She always had to lead in the dance. This visual contract with the viewer, I am always free, I am always on top, required constant fueling. She could not simply take off the suit in the evening and become a weak woman. The mask had grown to her face. She began to treat emotions just as she treated clothes, pragmatically and in a masculine way. Sex, it is just hygiene or sport. Love, it is partnership and loyalty, as in the army. Jealousy, it is the lot of the weak. She created the concept of cool long before James Dean and rock stars. But coolness means cold. To maintain this degree of coolness, she had to freeze her heart. Look at her photos in trousers, hands in pockets, legs crossed, a gaze directed into the distance. She is self-sufficient. She needs no one. And the world believed it. The world believed that Marlene Dietrich did not need warmth. And the world stopped giving her that warmth. When she walked the red carpet in her tailcoat, she was the most desired woman on the planet. But when she arrived at an empty hotel room and took off that tailcoat, she was left one-on-one with that same Maria, who simply wanted to be loved not for her style, but for who she was. But no one saw Maria. Everyone saw only the tailcoat. And perhaps the most terrible consequence of this gender hack manifested in her old age. Remember why she isolated herself? Because an old man can look dignified. An old dandy commands respect. But an old androgynous goddess is a tragedy. Her image was built on the perfect ringing line of the silhouette, on the contrast between male clothing and the female freshness of the face. When the face withered and the body lost its slenderness, the contrast disappeared. There would remain simply an elderly woman in men's clothes. It would look pitiful. And Marlene Dietrich would rather die than evoke pity. She became a hostage to the power, the freedom she stole from men. She learned to be free, but she forgot how to be happy. But this masculine core played a decisive role not only in fashion. When the world flew into the abyss, when absolute evil came to power in her homeland, it was this inner steel, that allowed her to commit an act that many real men did not dare to do. If the pantsuit was her armor, then the war became her crusade. And it was here, in the mud of the Ardennes and the ruins of Berlin, that the paradox of Marlene was finally formed. The higher she rose on the pedestal of moral authority, the deeper the abyss between her and the rest of humanity became. Many Hollywood stars participated in the war. They sold bonds, posed in front of airplanes, visited hospitals. It was patriotic PR. But what Marlene Dietrich did does not fit into the framework of PR. It was a personal, almost suicidal redemption. In 1936, Goebbels's envoys came to her. The Third Reich needed a face, and Marlene's face, perfectly Aryan, cold, majestic, suited it best. She was offered everything: a triumphant return to Berlin, the right to choose directors, scripts, partners herself, and, according to rumors, a blank check in which she could write any sum. She was to become the queen of German cinema, but she refused. And this refusal was dictated not only by politics, it was dictated by aesthetics. For Marlene Dietrich, Nazism was primarily vulgar. Stomping boots, the hysterical screams of the Führer, the bad taste of the wives of the Nazi elite, all this offended her sense of beauty. She was a snob in the highest sense of the word. Evil cannot be beautiful, which means there is no place for it in her universe. But simply refusing was not enough. She committed an act that many in Germany did not forgive her for until her very death. She did not just emigrate. She changed her citizenship to American and put on the uniform of the enemy army. For a German woman in the 40s, this was equivalent to shooting her own ancestors with her own hands. Marlene went to the front, not to safe bases in the rear. She went where the shooting was. In her war file, there are facts that seem like the script of an action movie, but this is documented reality. She spent a year and a half on the front lines, longer than any other entertainer. She was in Algeria, Italy, France, Germany. The reality of war for Dietrich was far from glamour. Imagine a woman who removed teeth for cheekbones and spent hours on styling, now sleeping on frozen ground wrapped in a greatcoat. There was no water. She washed with melted snow in her own helmet. She suffered from lice. She survived pneumonia. Here, at war, her Prussian upbringing and that very inner discipline we spoke of earlier found their ideal application. It turned out that the goddess of the screen was the ideal soldier. She never complained. Soldiers recalled how she held the hands of dying boys in field hospitals until their eyes glazed over. She was not playing a role. She was working. The most terrifying moment came during the Battle of the Bulge in the Ardennes. The front line was unstable, and there was a real risk that she would be captured by the SS. Marlene knew what the Nazis would do to her, to the main traitor of the Reich. It would not be just an execution. It would be a demonstrative humiliation. What does Marlene do? Does she carry a gun? No. She carries a capsule of cyanide in a locket around her neck. She made a firm decision. If the enemy broke through, she would not give them the pleasure of seeing her captured. She would kill herself instantly, and this was her freedom, the freedom of choice. Think about the psychological state of a person who goes on stage every day to sing songs, feeling the cold of poison on her skin. This is the highest point of tension. It is life on a razor's edge. And strangely enough, Marlene enjoyed it. The war gave her what Hollywood could not: a sense of reality and absolute crystal clarity of purpose. There was no falsehood here. Here there was only life and death. But the war ended, and the reckoning began. Marlene returned to America a hero. She received the Medal of Freedom, the highest award for civilians. Generals kissed her hands, but inside her, a black hole formed. She lost her homeland, not in a geographical sense, but in an existential one. When in 1960 she decided to come with concerts to the Federal Republic of Germany and West Berlin, she expected, perhaps not forgiveness, but understanding. She thought that the Germans had realized the horror of Nazism and would see in her a symbol of the other, true Germany. Reality struck her hard. In Dusseldorf, a young girl spat on her. Posters on the streets read, "Marlene, go home." Newspapers called her a traitor to the fatherland. During a performance in Berlin, someone threw an egg onto the stage and it broke at her feet. She stood on stage in her shining illusion dress and looked into a hall full of hatred. The very people for whose liberation she froze her feet in the trenches now despised her. At that moment, something inside her broke completely. She realized she no longer has a home. America was just a place of work. Germany became the enemy. Paris was neutral territory. She became a cosmopolitan against her will, an eternal wanderer without roots. Her anti-Nazism, her impeccable moral stance made her a monolith, a monument. But monuments are cold. Monuments are lonely. Her daughter, Maria, recalled a chilling episode from those times. Marlene often said, "We soldiers." She did not separate herself from the army. She continued to live by the laws of wartime and peaceful life. She demanded the same dedication, the same toughness, the same contempt for weakness from those around her. But the world around was already different. The world wanted to relax, forget the war, live in comfort. And Marlene despised comfort. She turned into a living reproach. Next to her, people felt small, cowardly, insufficiently heroic. Her moral superiority became a wall fencing her off from simple human relationships. How can one simply be friends with a woman who carried cyanide around her neck and looked into the face of Hitler? What to talk to her about? About the weather? About grocery prices? All everyday topics seemed insignificant next to her. She drove herself to this peak. Having become a symbol of freedom, she lost the freedom to be an ordinary person. A hero has no right to a mistake, to weakness, to Philistine happiness. And this brings us to the last, most intimate and most destructive aspect of her invention, to how this great woman soldier tried to love, or rather, how she tried to replace love with something else, because real love was too dangerous for her. Why were there many celebrities in her bed, yet she still fell asleep alone? We have approached the most closed and simultaneously most discussed part of the invention. If earlier we spoke about how Marlene constructed her body and her civic position, here we must open up the mechanism of her heart. Everyone says, Marlene Dietrich is a classic femme fatale, a devourer of men who changed lovers like gloves due to promiscuity or the search for the one. In reality, Marlene Dietrich was a sexual anarchist. She was not looking for a better half. She lived in a dimension where gender did not matter, and marriage was merely a legal screen. She became the first woman in Hollywood history who behaved like a wealthy, powerful white man. In the 1930s, a secret club existed in Hollywood, whispered about only behind closed doors. It was called the Sewing Circle. This was a code name for a community of influential women, actresses, writers, artists, who loved women. And Marlene was, if not the president of this club, then its honorary commander. For her, a connection with women was not just an experiment or a tribute to Berlin fashion of the 20s. It was a continuation of her philosophy of absolute freedom. Sex with a woman is much better, but living with her is impossible, she once dropped. This phrase exposes the cynical but honest mechanics of her feelings. With women, she found sensuality and understanding that men lacked, but she categorically refused to fall into emotional dependence on anyone. Her loudest and most dramatic romance with a woman was the connection with Mercedes D'Acosta, a famous poet and screenwriter who was the main open lesbian of Hollywood at that time. Mercedes was obsessed with Marlene. She bombarded her with flowers, wrote passionate letters. How did Marlene behave? Like a true bachelor. She accepted the worship. She sent Mercedes bunches of violets, their secret symbol. She was tender, passionate, but the second Mercedes began to demand eternal love and exclusivity, Marlene turned on the cold. There is a famous story when Marlene, running late for a meeting, simply stepped over Mercedes sitting on the threshold of her dressing room in tears and threw out, "Do not make scenes. It is vulgar." This was not cruelty for the sake of cruelty. This was boundary protection. Marlene Dietrich created the myth of a woman without attachments. She could not afford to get bogged down in the sticky web of other people's emotions. She was ready to give pleasure, money, protection, but not her freedom. Her relationships with women were a zone of total anarchy. Patriarchal rules did not work here. Among her passions, confirmed or existing at the level of very loud rumors, are named Edith Piaf, Claudette Colbert, and even, according to some versions, her main rival, Greta Garbo. With Edith Piaf, they were connected by something more than friendship. Marlene was a mentor, a protector, almost a maternal figure for the little sparrow, but with a clear erotic subtext. She gave Piaf jewelry, a famous gold cross with emeralds, taught her how to dress, and pulled her out of depressions. Here Marlene again acted in a masculine role. She was a Pygmalion, a patron, a strong shoulder. She liked to dominate, liked to be the one on whom others depend. But how did this rainbow freedom combine with her legion of male lovers? Eric Maria Remarque, Jean Gabin, Ernest Hemingway, Yul Brynner. The list looks like an encyclopedia of testosterone. But the truth is that Marlene used men just as men have used women for centuries. For status, for entertainment, for confirmation of her power. Take her romance with Remarque. The writer poured his soul out in letters that later became classics of literature. "Tell me that you love me." And what did Marlene do? She read these letters to her other mistresses and lovers at breakfast, chuckling at their sentimentality. This is shocking, but it proves. For her, feelings were material. She collected geniuses. She was flattered that the best minds of the era were going crazy over her, but she herself remained an observer. She was like a tourist in the country of someone else's pain. She watched, took photos, but never stayed there to live. And the romance with Jean Gabin? It was a battle of two alpha males. Gabin wanted a normal woman. Marlene tried to play this role. Famous stories about how she scrubbed floors and cooked soup, but she did not last long. As soon as Gabin tried to lock her in the cage of the family hearth, she rebelled. She could not belong to one person. This violated her visual contract with the whole world. A goddess belongs to everyone, which means to no one. And here we come to the ingenious engineering solution that allowed this entire construction to stay afloat for half a century. The name of this solution is Rudolf Sieber, her husband. They married in 1923 and did not divorce until his death in 1976, yet they did not live together for decades. Rudolph had a constant woman, Tamara, with whom he lived practically in a common-law marriage. Marlene not only knew about this, she was friends with Tamara, supported both of them, and wrote them letters full of care. What for? Was this sainthood? No. It was a cynical and brilliant calculation. Her husband was her human shield. When another lover, Remarque Gabin, or someone from the sewing circle, began to demand marriage, obligations, or moving in, Marlene would make a sad face and say, "Oh, my love, I would give you everything. But you know, I have Rudy. He is Catholic, or he is sick, or he will not give a divorce. I cannot abandon my poor husband." Her husband was her alibi. He was the guarantor of her freedom. As long as she was married to a ghost, she was invulnerable to real obligations. It was freedom of the highest standard, but frozen freedom. She built her life so as never to find herself in the position of being abandoned. She always left first, or she made sure they left her, but by her rules. Marlene Dietrich proved that a woman can live outside the rules. She can sleep with whomever she wants, men or women, can wear a tailcoat, can reject dictators. But this medal had a reverse side. Freedom, without attachments, means that ultimately, you have no one left who considers you their own. Lovers left, started families, had children, aged together with someone. Women from the sewing circle found permanent partners, and Marlene remained alone, an eternal drifter of the luxury class. In her final years, in that very bed on Avenue Montaigne, she surrounded herself with photographs, hundreds of portraits. Hemingway, Remarque, Piaf, Gabin, they were all dead. She outlived them all. She looked at these faces and perhaps understood that she had won the war for independence but lost the battle for warmth. She was free, absolutely, sterilely free. No one could order her around. No one could hurt her. But no one could warm her either. She created an image of a woman who needs no one, and the universe, possessing a cruel sense of humor, granted her wish. At the end of the journey, she truly needed no one. But she was also needed by no one, except film historians. The myth of the woman without attachments turned out to be a trap. Because a human is a social being, we define ourselves through attachments. By rejecting them for the sake of preserving the image, Marlene Dietrich gradually erased herself, turning into a beautiful but cold hologram. So before us lies the disassembled mechanism. We started with the question, how did a woman who became a symbol of freedom end up in prison? Now you know the answer. The prison was not built by Nazis, nor by Hollywood producers, nor by abandoned lovers. Marlene Dietrich built it herself, brick by brick, from her own discipline, perfectionism, and fear of being ordinary. She spent her life proving that Marlene is not a woman of flesh and blood, but an idea. An idea does not sweat, does not age, does not cry, and does not need warmth. An idea is flawless. But the problem is that ideas do not know how to live. This is the greatest irony of her fate. She won her war. She truly defeated time. Look at any portrait of her today, decades after her death. You do not see a decrepit old woman dying in filth on Avenue Montaigne. You see an eternal, shining, inaccessible goddess. She cheated death by substituting her body with a legend. But the price she paid for this trick is the rejection of everything human. She pulled out teeth for cheekbones, froze her heart for style, and walled herself up alive for eternal youth. The story of Marlene Dietrich is not a Cinderella fairy tale. It is a warning. It is a story about what happens when you allow your avatar, your image on social networks, your best version, to completely consume the real you. when the desire to seem conquers the need to be. She left, leaving us a flawless facade. But now, when you watch her films or see her photo in a tuxedo, you will know what hides behind that squint. You will see not only the glitter of gold dust on her hair, but also the tightly stretched tape under the wig, pulling the skin to the point of pain. And perhaps this pain will make her not just an icon to you, but a living person whom no one ever really knew. But if you think that Marlene Dietrich was the only victim of the Hollywood meat grinder, you are deeply mistaken. Her story is an example of hard power, when a woman herself becomes the tyrant of her body. Marlene locked herself within 4 walls because she was panic-stricken that the world would see her old. She became a prisoner of her own vanity. But there was another goddess in Hollywood, Marlene's main rival, a woman who did what Dietrich never could. She left at the peak of fame at 36 years old. She also chose seclusion. She also hid her face. But if for Marlene loneliness was torture, then for her it became the highest form of freedom. Why did one die in agony, trying to hold on to an illusion, while the other found peace by simply telling the world, "Leave me alone"? This is a story about how to leave the stage in time so as not to be thrown off it. If you want to know the secret of the Snow Queen of Hollywood, write, and I will definitely tell you the story of Greta Garbo. See you there.